died last year because of this criminal activity. It's atrocious. Let's talk about some of the people who are affected. There's a woman here, Stephanie Bergman. In 2005, she was in a car wreck. She was in some pain. Doctor prescribed her OxyContin. So over the next decade, she battled against addiction. So the solution to that was to cut her off of her pills. Do you think that actually stopped her addiction? No, it didn't help her. She didn't have access to mental health care. She didn't have access to appropriate care. So what she do? She turns to heroin and fentanyl. And in 2015, the very day that she was supposed to check into rehab, she died of an overdose at age 43. That's the type of thing that's happening in your backyard. Meanwhile, you have these people like McKesson, like AmerisourceBergen, they're throwing lavish conferences. They're taking doctors out to Palm Springs, Orlando, Miami, and they're telling them, go out and sell these pills. Increase your quotas. Get more patients. And how are you going to get it? You're going to tell them that these pills are not addictive. You're going to tell them that pain is something that they have to treat with a pill. Instead of rehab, instead of surgery, instead of actual medicine, these people were pimped out so that they could just pass pills along on behalf of people like McKesson, a Fortune 5 company, one of the biggest companies in the country. It's atrocious that they're doing this. And now it's time, because here's the thing. We've known for a while that these people have been doing these bad things. McKesson was fined $150 million. Now that sounds like a lot of money. But Archie, how much money did McKesson make last year?
$198.5 billion.
$198.5 billion last year. You know what that was? Peter tells this all the time. He says it's a parking ticket. That's exactly what happened. 91 people will die each day. Actually, as many as 170 people will die each day. And they paid a parking ticket. That is atrocious. That's awful. And nobody's going to hold them accountable because, like you said, the DEA was bought and sold. Your leaders were bought and sold. Eric Holder was bought and sold. Yep. And they did nothing. So finally, you know what? It's time that we do something. It's time that we start telling these stories. We start telling about this bad behavior of these massive companies. And instead of giving them parking tickets, we're going to go after their big bucks. And we're going to give it back to the communities that need it. This community right here, they had to spend $3 million to build an emergency room just for overdoses. They're going to have an emergency room in Palm Beach County for just overdoses that came out of your money, the taxpayers' money. And it's not fair.
Well, Peter, why don't you talk about liability? Let's pick up the liability and then damages. I want you to hear about the damages.
In order to understand some of the conclusions that we just walked through, it's important to understand what the responsibilities of these companies are. So let's start with 1970, Controlled Substance Act. The Controlled Substance Act closed the systems for opiates. And the reason why the system was closed is because Congress recognized the addictive nature of opiates, that this was potentially a huge problem, and they wanted to track the pills as they left the manufacturers, to the distributors, to the pharmacies and doctors and hospitals. Every single pill that leaves the manufacturers is tracked. Congress recognized that the manufacturers selling directly to the pill mills, directly to the doctors, directly to the hospitals was a problem. So a position of trust was created through the distributors. That's McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, and Cardinal. Congress said, we're going to put these gatekeepers, a position of trust. They're the beat cops. They're the ones that are supposed to monitor, identify, and report the suspicious activity. So it was entirely foreseeable back in the 1970s when the CSA was enacted that there were potentially problems with the addictive nature of opiates and the amount of pills coming into the communities. So Congress said, we're going to give you licenses. You have to apply for these licenses. You have to report the suspicious activity to the DEA. That was their jobs. That was their sole job. Not delivery trucks. Their job was to be the beat cops and protect us, our children, our neighbors, and our loved ones from these pills hitting the communities in suspicious orders and what's called diversion. So 1970, I'm going to fast forward you all the way to 2005, 2006. The DEA became increasingly frustrated with the distributors and manufacturers with the number of pills that were coming into our communities. Let's use Lakeland, Florida as an example. Lakeland, Florida, 2 pharmacies in Lakeland generated more opiates than the rest of Florida combined. So the DEA came in time after time after time with warnings and warning letters. And you got to knock it off. You got to stop distributing these pills in these communities. You got to shut down these pill mills. So they actually issued a suspension in 2005, 2006. They suspended that McKesson facility. When they came back a year later to audit the suspension, what they found out is not only had the pills to these 2 pharmacies not only not decreased, not stopped, but they more than doubled. Wow. McKesson rerouted the pills into Lakeland from their regional distribution center to their other distribution centers under their other licenses. They went around what the order was. They went around the suspension order from the DEA out of the Lakeland, Florida office, and they increased the amount of pills. So this isn't about turning a blind eye. This isn't, oh, we missed it. This isn't a matter of, oh, we just kind of looked the other way, it's okay. They targeted the pill mills. It was part of the business plan. The more pills they sold, the better their bottom lines are. If you track and plot out deaths per capita, pills per capita, and earnings per share, they're all on the same trajectory up. Somebody mentioned the McKesson CEO salary last year, $150, $160 million. Their fine of $150 million was the exact same amount as their CEO made. It's a drop in the bucket. So 2005, 2006 starts the investigations increase. The amount of pills are not decreasing. The amount of pills are still going sky high. DEA increases the investigations. They continue with the talk. Take no dramatic steps. As Pat mentioned, no one goes to jail. There's no criminal investigations. There's no grand juries. There's nobody being held accountable. Why? Because all we're doing is paying these small, tiny fines, and the profits from selling the pills far exceed any cost to defend, any cost to pay the fines, any administrative actions. It's cheap. It's cheap to pay the fines. It's cheap to pay the lawyers because of the amount of money we're making.
Plus taxpayers end up paying that.
Exactly. And the taxpayers ended up paying the fines, is what happens. Those are the shareholders. It certainly isn't from the CEOs that are pocketing $150 million a year. So now 2005, 2006, the DEA starts with their educational campaign, that they're sending out letters. They're advising them about what they're supposed to be doing to monitor, what they're supposed to be doing to identify this, what they're supposed to be doing to report the suspicious activity. So that's 2005, 2006. The pattern continues. This has now gone on for almost 15 years. 2015, 2016 is when you start to see the larger fines come out. The DEA recommended $1 billion in fines to the DOJ. $1 billion. The fine ended up being $150 million. They recommended that there were criminal investigations. No criminal investigations. They recommended there were administrative actions. There were no administrative actions. They recommended that these fines that the licenses not be suspended, but be revoked. Nothing. DOJ made those decisions. They shut down the DEA, quashed the investigations, and hit them with a $150 million fine. The West Virginia AG filed suit against the distributors in 2015, 2016. As he was leaving office, the new AG in West Virginia was directly from the pharmaceutical industry as a lobbyist. He shut down the suit, settled it for $25 million in West Virginia. The only thing good that came out of the West Virginia litigation was that the ARCOS data that Pat mentioned earlier. So we talked about every single pill being tracked from manufacturer to pharmacy. Every single one of those is in a database that no one's ever seen besides the DEA. In West Virginia, the summary data was released. Now, what was amazing about the summary data in West Virginia is the number of pills. Over a 6-year span, 130 million pills came into West Virginia over 6 years. 130 million pills. And I bought 780 million pills over the 6 years, 130 million pills per year. And that is in a state with 1.8 million people. The reason why we know those numbers is because the ARCOS database in that one state. The only reason those have been published is because the Charleston Gazette interceded in the case, demanded that they see these documents, this database, took it all the way up to the state Supreme Court and was giving access to the documents. No one would release it. The DEA didn't release it. The AG didn't release it. West Virginia Gazette, he ended up winning a Pulitzer Prize for the work on the West Virginia Gazette. These numbers splashed across the headlines. We are going to see the same numbers across the country when we get access to this ARCOS database. Next week, we're in front of the federal judge. The federal judge has given direction to the DEA to produce the ARCOS database for the very first time. Next week will be the first time these numbers are going to be seen around the country when this is produced and put into the databases so we can see just how many pills have hit our communities across the country. Now that's the distributor side. The manufacturer side, I'm going to use Mallinckrodt as an example, or Purdue that made OxyContin, but Mallinckrodt's a great example. It demonstrates just how pervasive, I mentioned earlier, this isn't turning a blind eye, this is part of the business plan. So Mallinckrodt is based out of St. Louis. Last year in June, July, they were hit with about a $35 million fine for a chargeback scheme. The DEA's $35 million fine on the chargeback, we called our DEA experts, the ones that had run the McKesson investigation, and we said, tell us about the chargebacks. It's something we hadn't heard about before. And he said the chargebacks were that the manufacturers were paying the distributors, the chargebacks, also known as a kickback, were paying the distributors for information downstream about where the pills were ending up. So they would know where the problem areas were. They would know where the holes were. They would know where the diversion was happening. So these chargebacks enabled the manufacturers, it's pervasive in the industry, the manufacturers to be aware, to know where the holes in the system were. So the DEA said, you are now responsible because you knew about the suspicious orders and did absolutely nothing about it. So in the complaints that we filed, we have added a RICO claim, a racketeering claim, conspiracy claim. The pattern of criminal conduct between these companies all the way upstream at the manufacturers to the distributors to the pill mills is a pattern of criminal activity, racketeering activity. It's a conspiracy that they targeted the problem areas, and as you look at the hardest hit areas from Ohio down Appalachia into Florida, typically they are the hardest hit socioeconomic areas in the country. The pharmaceutical industry targeted the hardest hit areas, put as many pills, as many people in those areas as they could on opiates, tooth extractions, headaches, you name it, dumped as many pills here and embraced this business culture to profit at the bottom line at the expense of our neighbors, our loved ones, and our kids. This story had not regularly hit the national press until our consortium of law firms started filing lawsuits in late 2016, early 2017. How many of you have heard of the opiate crisis on a regular basis or saw it in the national press before late 2016, early 2017? How many people have seen it in the last 6 months? The reason is because we have 450 lawsuits representing cities and counties. The regulators didn't do anything. The AGs have hardly done anything. They settled a group of cases back in 2005. 25 AGs in 2005 settled against the manufacturers for a total of $25 million and didn't hold anyone's feet to the fire.
That was nationally. They made that much money while we've been sitting here talking.
$25 million, the entire industry, 25 different state AGs. 25 million in total.
And by the way, if you looked at the news reports after that, the AGs were up there saying, We have solved the opioid crisis.
Press releases,
There's no more
parades,
problem.
banners.
It's gone away now. They paid $25 million. Everybody's okay now.
Confetti. I mean, $25 million was a drop
Nationally,
in the
for
bucket.
everything in the country.
The only reason the stories hit the national press is we have 450 cases filed in federal court in Cleveland that have been consolidated. Yes, sir.
How are your actions now because of those settlements not considered double jeopardy?
Well, here's why. Here's why. They settle up to a point in time. It's continuing. In other words, if you settle up to, say, 2009,
Right.
everything between 2009 and now is just a brand new case. It's called a continuing tort is the concept. Same
It's
thing we
also
do
a
with
different
tobacco.
claim. It's a different claim as well. Cities and counties claims that taxpayers are fronted are different than the cases that were filed in 05 and 06. Right, so that's kind of the liability or some of the factual background. Archie's going to walk you through what the damage models are and how we want to impact the communities in a positive way to fix the mess.
Thanks, Peter. Good job. So what do? We can talk all day about the problems. We can talk all day about the tragedy that has visited every family in every community in which we live. One of the reasons that we want to talk about the damages piece is what this law firm does and our colleagues do is we prepare for litigation. I can promise you that the last thing in the world McKesson and Cardinal and Amerisource Bergen want is Mike Papantonio's undivided attention. So what we do and what we've always done is we look at the law, and as Peter was alluding to it, the RICO statutes, the public nuisance statutes, we look at the law. And we look at what the jury is going to be charged the law to be at the end of the case. And on those facts, we built a lawsuit so that at the end of the day, we have proven all the elements that Peter was just talking about, and we feel that we're going to be very successful in prevailing in the jury, with a jury. But what do we do about it? So, cutting back on the supply of opioids has some positive in that there are less numbers of new addicts. But we know from past history that ending the supply of prescription drugs doesn't really solve the problem. CDC statistics show that 4 in 5 heroin addicts today got their start on a prescription drug. So what happens when that working blue-collar guy's life falls apart because of his fusion in his back, or that 18-year-old athlete loses his college career because of his ACL and they get hooked on opioids, the lives fall apart. There is no job for the blue-collar worker. There is no future for the young man or young lady that's injured in the high school athletic arena, or for the soccer mom who had the root canal that gets hooked on opioids. They leave and have in many places, and in many examples, a zombie land of people that can't help themselves. So, number one, we're going to hold them accountable. Number two, all this lawsuit can really do is generate funding to take care of this tragic mess created by these companies who last year generated $500 billion of revenue. So we're going to get the money, but here's if I can just, and some of this really has a lot to do with you guys helping us. What we're not going to do with the money is piss it away by creating some new institution. This thing has been studied to death. The problem is this simple. How many addicts exist in our community? And what is it going to take over the next 10 years or 20 years to give them the best chance of recovery? Because we know some of them are going to die. So you can scratch that off the continuum that we're trying to extrapolate. We know some of them are on a scale of 1 to 10, a 2 in terms of addiction. And some of them are a 10, and just like Ms. Bergman, she's going to take that heroin with fentanyl and die. So it's a problem. And the great thing is, in sitting and listening to you guys and being with you, there's so many good people out there doing good things for the right reasons. And what Mike and I talk about a lot is tapping into those already existing resources and then trying to get the physician community and the nurse association and others that are out there on a day-to-day basis to help us, again, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So we want a treatment piece that includes, do we need additional beds in these communities? How do we get the poverty-stricken access Do we need transportation systems to help them get to the facilities? You know, we can't. It would be great if we could put everybody that's got an addiction problem, you know, in an institution for a year. But that's not really practical. It would be great if we could, but it's just not practical. So we need a treatment facility that we can keep them in there for 60 to 90 days, hopefully. And then we need really to spend time and energy and listen to the people who treat and help recovery on a day-to-day basis here, and talk about what happens from the 4th month to the 10th month or the 12th month. How do we help them along? I was in D.C. with the head of the Ohio Medical Association, and he was talking about so many different ways that we can do telemedicine and telepsychology in terms of support, much like the AA, but they are able to get to it. So, you know, there's lots of ways that we can help. And this lawsuit is going to generate the revenue that we hope. And we hope we're working with you to put together a plan to help treat the victims of this tragedy.
Archie Lamb is going to be one of the people building the model for rehab. Now, in this room, come on, well, you have ideas. What is your how can they reach you? Please tell them.
Just alam@levinlaw.com.
alam@levinlaw.com. This model is the whole key. We're already talking to some of the best experts in the world, absolutely the best experts in the world. But I have a feeling that in this room you have some things you can give us as far as ideas. And I would appreciate that. Listen, thank you. I'm working on a book right now. I have a series of 4 books that's called, the first one was called Law and Disorder. The second was called Law and Vengeance. The one I'm working on right now is called Law in Zombieland, because that's what they call these areas that are hit with this blight. Take a look at Law and Vengeance and you'll see we've really gotten to the point where we have to tell these stories in fictional books. That's why I started writing these books. Read Law and Vengeance, you'll understand that was the story about a weapons manufacturer that made a defective product and a whistleblower came forward. It's a case we really handled. But we have to tell these stories in fictional books to get people to understand and communicate. Take a look at the book Law and Vengeance. If you get it in Barnes & Noble, Amazon. I'm telling you that because we've gotten to that point to where we have to tell these stories in fictional books for people to really understand what happened. Thanks. We appreciate it.
Just mentioned that on a micro level, but not as a clinical psychologist in the VA system in New York, psychiatrists were absolutely, constantly, and not every psychiatrist, but many of them, were giving out